The early morning sun streamed through the large glass windows of Atlanta International Airport's Terminal A, casting long shadows across the polished floors. It was just another busy Monday morning, with travelers rushing about, dragging their wheelie bags and clutching their phones and coffee cups. Among the crowd walked Mrs. Richardson, her designer heels clicking purposefully against the floor as she made her way to Gate 7. Her perfectly styled hair and crisp business suit spoke of someone used to commanding attention in corporate boardrooms. At 45, she'd worked her way up to becoming one of the top marketing executives at her firm, and she carried herself with the confidence that came from years of getting exactly what she wanted. She'd just wrapped up a successful business meeting and was heading back to Los Angeles, her Gucci bag containing contracts worth millions. The first-class ticket had been a given. After all, she'd closed a deal that would make her company very happy. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile as she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent. "Good morning, ma'am. Welcome aboard. First class is to your left," the flight attendant greeted her warmly as she stepped onto the plane. Mrs. Richardson nodded, already mentally preparing for the 5-hour flight, during which she planned to finish reviewing her presentation for tomorrow's board meeting. The first-class cabin was exactly as she liked it, quiet, exclusive, and pristine. She counted the rows. 2A and B, those were her seats. But as she approached, she stopped short. There was already someone sitting in the window seat next to hers. A well-dressed man in his early 50s was settled comfortably in 2A, reading through some documents spread out on the fold-out table. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. A sleek leather briefcase rested at his feet. But it wasn't his obvious wealth or professional appearance that made Mrs. Richardson's smile freeze on her face. It was something else entirely, something that made her grip her handbag a little tighter and purse her lips in what she probably thought was a discreet show of displeasure. The mental calculations began immediately in her head. Surely there had been some mistake with the seating arrangement. Someone of her status shouldn't have to. Well, she glanced around, noting that other first-class passengers were still boarding, some already settling into their seats with newspapers and laptops. The man in 2A briefly looked up from his papers, offering a polite, professional nod before returning to what appeared to be important documentation. His gold cufflinks caught the cabin light as he turned a page, and a glimpse of his watch. A limited-edition timepiece suggested he was no stranger to luxury. But Mrs. Richardson had already made up her mind. She stood in the aisle, effectively blocking other passengers trying to board, and raised her hand to catch the attention of a passing flight attendant. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone used to having their demands met immediately. "I need to speak with you about the seating arrangements." The flight attendant, whose name tag read Linda, approached with a professional smile. She'd been working first class long enough to recognize the look on Mrs. Richardson's face. She'd seen it many times before. "Is there something I can help you with?" Linda asked, maintaining her warm, professional demeanor despite having a pretty good idea where this conversation was headed. What Mrs. Richardson didn't realize, as she prepared to voice her complaints, was that this seemingly routine Monday morning flight was about to become anything but ordinary. The man quietly reading his documents beside her assigned seat wasn't just any first-class passenger, and the next few moments would set in motion events that would change perspectives, challenge assumptions, and perhaps even make headlines. The other passengers continuing to board the plane had no idea they were about to witness something that would later be shared thousands of times on social media and spark conversations across the country. Some were already pulling out their phones, preparing to switch them to airplane mode, unaware that they might soon be using them to document an unexpected confrontation in first class. Little did Mrs. Richardson know, her carefully constructed world of privilege and assumptions was about to be turned upside down, all because of who was sitting quietly in seat 2A. Linda, the flight attendant, could feel the tension building as Mrs. Richardson leaned in close, attempting to whisper but failing to keep her voice as quiet as she thought. "I need to discuss my seating arrangement," she said, gesturing vaguely towards seat 2A. "Surely there must be other options available." The way she emphasized other made her meaning crystal clear. Several nearby passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, some shaking their heads slightly. A young woman in row 3 had already pulled out her phone, though it wasn't clear if she was texting or recording. "I'm a frequent flyer with platinum status," Mrs. Richardson continued, pulling out her loyalty card as if it were a trump card in a high-stakes game. "I'd always book first class specifically for a certain level of, well, you understand what I mean." She gave what she probably thought was a knowing look to Linda, who maintained her professional composure despite the growing discomfort of the situation. The man in 2A continued reviewing his documents, but a supple tension in his shoulders suggested he heard every word. He adjusted his expensive watch, then reached down to pull another folder from his briefcase, one bearing the airline's executive letterhead, though Mrs. Richardson was too preoccupied with her complaints to notice this detail. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," Linda replied, her voice carrying just enough firmness to suggest she wasn't actually sorry at all, "but the flight is completely full today. Every seat in first class has been assigned." She gestured to the growing line of passengers still trying to board behind Mrs. Richardson. "Perhaps you'd like to take your seat so others can get settled." But Mrs. Richardson wasn't finished. "Well then, perhaps we could speak to the purser? Or the captain?" She fumbled in her designer bag, presumably looking for her business card. "I work with several major corporations, and our company books hundreds of flights with your airline annually. I'm sure we can find a more suitable arrangement." A businessman across the aisle couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at this display. He caught the eye of the man in 2A, who gave him a barely perceptible smile, the kind that suggested he was more amused than offended by the entire situation. "I must insist," Mrs. Richardson continued, her voice rising slightly as her frustration grew. "This is about maintaining certain standards in first class. I'm sure you understand what I mean." She glanced meaningfully at the man in 2A, then quickly looked away when she realized he was watching her performance with calm interest. Linda's professional smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened just slightly. She'd dealt with passengers like Mrs. Richardson before, but something about this particular situation made her want to smile for entirely different reasons. She knew exactly who was sitting in 2A, and the irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. "Ma'am," Linda began, choosing her words carefully, "I can assure you that everyone in first class today is exactly where they're supposed to be." She put a subtle emphasis on exactly that made a couple of regular first-class passengers look up with interest. They'd flown enough to recognize Linda, and they knew that tone in her voice usually preceded something interesting. The man in 2A slowly closed his folder and sat up straighter, his movement drawing attention. His perfectly tailored suit, which probably cost more than Mrs. Richardson's monthly car payment, seemed to gleam under the cabin lights. He reached into his inner jacket pocket, and for a moment, it seemed he might finally say something. A few rows back, someone whispered, "Isn't that?" before being quickly shushed by their companion. The whisper traveled through first class like a gentle ripple, causing more passengers to look up from their phones and magazines. Mrs. Richardson, still standing in the aisle, remained oblivious to the shifting atmosphere around her. She was too focused on her own indignation to notice the knowing looks being exchanged between the flight attendants, or the way some passengers had begun to smile in anticipation. The air in the first-class cabin grew thick with tension and expectation. It was the kind of moment where everyone could sense something big was about to happen. Everyone, that is, except the person about to be at the center of it all. Linda glanced at her watch, then at the man in 2A, who gave her a slight nod. The next few moments would teach Mrs. Richardson a lesson about assumptions and privilege that no corporate diversity training ever could. The only question was, how would she handle the revelation that was about to come? Linda took a deep breath, and her next words came out with the precision of someone who knew they were about to change the entire dynamic of the situation. "Ma'am, perhaps I should mention the gentleman you're refusing to sit next to is Mr. Thompson, our airline's chief executive officer." The words hung in the air for a moment, seeming to echo in the sudden silence that fell over the first-class cabin. Mrs. Richardson's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: disbelief, shock, and then something close to horror as the full implications of her behavior began to sink in. She started to say, but for once, words failed her completely. Her designer bag slipped from her shoulder, and she barely caught it in time. A few soft chuckles could be heard from nearby passengers, quickly muffled behind hands and magazines. Mr. Thompson finally looked up fully from his documents, his expression calm and measured. He wore the kind of smile that came from years of dealing with difficult situations with grace. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying the warm authority of someone used to commanding boardrooms. "I believe we'll be sharing this row for the next few hours." He gestured to the empty seat beside him with a gentle politeness that somehow made the situation even more uncomfortable for Mrs. Richardson. By now, phones were discreetly recording throughout the cabin. A young tech executive in row 4 was already typing furiously on his phone, no doubt sharing the unfolding scene on social media. The businessman across the aisle had given up any pretense of reading his newspaper and was watching with undisguised interest. I had no idea," Mrs. Richardson stammered, her face flushing deep red. Her platinum frequent flyer card was still clutched in her hand, now seeming more like evidence of her embarrassing behavior than the status symbol she'd intended it to be. "Few people do, actually," Mr. Thompson replied, his voice carrying no hint of anger or resentment. "I prefer to fly like any other passenger. It helps me stay in touch with our customers' experiences." He paused thoughtfully. "All of our customers." Linda stood nearby, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. She'd worked for the airline for 15 years and had seen her share of entitled behavior, but this moment, this perfect moment of justice served with elegance, would definitely be one for the break room stories. An older gentleman 2 rows back, who'd been quietly observing everything, nodded in approval. He'd worked in corporate America for 40 years and had seen too many similar scenarios play out differently. The way Mr. Thompson was handling this situation was a masterclass in leadership and grace under pressure. Mrs. Richardson's legs seemed to have turned to jelly, and she half fell into her assigned seat. Her carefully curated image of corporate sophistication had crumbled in a matter of minutes, and now she sat rigid with embarrassment, staring straight ahead as if she could make herself invisible through sheer force of will. "Can I get either of you something to drink before takeoff?" Linda asked, her voice pleasant and professional, as if the last few minutes hadn't happened at all. The normality of the question somehow highlighted the extraordinariness of what had just transpired. "Just water for me, thank you," Mr. Thompson replied, then glanced at his seatmate with genuine courtesy. "Mrs. Richardson." The use of her name, which she hadn't given him, reminded her that as CEO, he probably had access to the passenger manifest. This small detail somehow made everything even more mortifying. "Water would be fine," she managed to whisper. The other passengers were settling back into their pre-flight routines, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was a sense of witnessing something significant, a moment where prejudice and privilege had collided with reality in the most unexpected way. Mr. Thompson returned to his documents, but now they were clearly visible, proposals for the airline's new diversity and inclusion initiative. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who could see them. A presentation slide titled "Breaking Barriers in Corporate Culture" was clearly visible on top of his stack. Mrs. Richardson's phone buzzed in her bag, probably work emails or messages from colleagues about tomorrow's meetings. But for the first time in her career, she couldn't bring herself to look at it. Instead, she sat there, confronted with thoughts and realizations that would take more than a 5-hour flight to fully process. The plane's engines began their startup sequence, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly for takeoff. As they waited for final clearance, the weight of unspoken words hummed between seats 2A and 2B. This flight was about to become much more than just a trip from Atlanta to Los Angeles. It was about to become a journey of a very different kind. The first 30 minutes of the flight passed in what felt like the longest silence Mrs. Richardson had ever experienced. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, stealing occasional glances at the man beside her. Each time she did, she noticed something new that made her internal cringe even deeper. His custom-made wedding ring that probably cost more than her car, the way other passengers kept looking at him with respect and recognition, how the flight attendants checked on him with genuine warmth rather than just professional courtesy. Her mind raced through the events of the past hour, replaying every word she'd said, every gesture she'd made. The memory of her own behavior made her stomach churn. She'd built her career on being able to read rooms and people, on knowing exactly how to handle any situation. Yet here she was, sitting next to one of the most powerful executives in the airline industry, having just made the worst first impression possible. The seat belt sign dinged off, and she watched as Mr. Thompson smoothly pulled out his laptop, the latest model she couldn't help but notice, and began reviewing what appeared to be quarterly reports. The numbers visible on his screen had more zeros than her annual salary. A flight attendant passed by, offering drinks. "Your usual green tea, sir?" she asked Mr. Thompson with genuine respect. He nodded with a warm smile that made Mrs. Richardson sink even lower in her seat. She declined her own drink with a barely audible whisper. Minutes ticked by like hours. She pulled out her phone, opened her email, closed it, opened her presentation for tomorrow, closed it again. Nothing could hold her attention. The weight of her actions pressed down on her like a physical thing. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she turned slightly toward Mr. Thompson. She began, then stopped, realizing she had no idea how to even start apologizing for what she'd done. Mr. Thompson looked up from his work, his expression open and attentive. There was no anger in his face, no resentment, which somehow made it even worse. "Yes?" he prompted gently when she didn't continue. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been more ashamed of myself in my life." The words came out in a rush, and to her horror, she felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. Mr. Thompson closed his laptop slowly, giving her his full attention. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been in the airline industry for over 25 years. Started as a baggage handler in college, worked my way up through customer service, operations, management, every step of the way." He paused, letting the information sink in. "And in all those years, I've learned that the most valuable moments often come from our most uncomfortable situations." A flight attendant passed by with the drink cart again, and this time Mrs. Richardson accepted a glass of water, if only to have something to do with her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly as she took a sip. "When I was starting out," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice carrying a hint of reflection, "I had a supervisor who told me something I've never forgotten. He said, 'In aviation, like in life, it's not about the turbulence you hit, it's about how you handle it.'" He smiled slightly at the memory. I found that to be true in more ways than one. Mrs. Richardson listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in longer than she could remember. She thought about her own journey up the corporate ladder, how she'd fought to be taken seriously as a woman in a male-dominated industry. How had she let that struggle turn her into someone who would do to others what had once been done to her? "I used to think success was about climbing higher than everyone else," she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. "But sitting here now," she gestured helplessly, unable to finish the thought. "Success means different things to different people," Mr. Thompson replied. "But in my experience, true success isn't about how high you climb, it's about how many people you bring up with you." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek business card holder. "Which reminds me." Mrs. Richardson watched as he selected a card, wondering if this was the moment he'd report her behavior to her company, effectively ending her career. Instead, he handed her a card with a gentle smile that held no malice. "We're launching a new corporate initiative next month," he explained, watching as she read the card with trembling fingers. "It's focused on breaking down barriers in the workplace, all kinds of barriers. I think your perspective could be valuable." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Here she was, being offered an opportunity by the very person she'd tried to avoid sitting next to. The realization made her eyes well up again, but this time for a very different reason. Outside the window, clouds drifted by at 35,000 feet, reminding her that sometimes the greatest distances we travel have nothing to do with physical miles. As the plane continued its journey westward, Mrs. Richardson began to understand that this flight would take her much further than just Los Angeles. It would take her on a journey of personal transformation she never expected to make. As the flight reached its cruising altitude, Mr. Thompson pulled out a presentation folder labeled Breaking Barriers Initiative. He opened it carefully, revealing colorful graphs and statistics about workplace diversity. "You know," he began, his voice warm but professional, "I'd actually prefer when people don't recognize me on flights. It gives me a chance to see how our airline really works." Mrs. Richardson shifted in her seat, finally finding the courage to fully face him. How do you deal with it? She asked quietly. The prejudice, the assumptions, people like me. The last words came out barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson smiled thoughtfully, taking a moment to consider his response. Would you believe me if I told you that moments like these actually give me hope? She looked at him in surprise, and he continued, in my 30 years of business, I've learned that real change doesn't happen in boardrooms or through mandatory training videos. It happens in moments like this, when people are forced to confront their own biases head-on. He pulled out another document, this one filled with employee testimonials. When I started as a baggage handler, I had a dream of changing the airline industry, not just the business side, but the human side too. Back then, people told me I was reaching too high. He chuckled softly. But you know what? Sometimes you need to reach high to help others climb up. Mrs. Richardson found herself leaning forward, genuinely interested. How did you do it? Make it to the top, I mean. One step at a time, he replied, turning to a page in his presentation. And lots of help along the way. Here, look at this. He pointed to a chart showing the airline's diversity statistics over the past decade. When I became CEO, these numbers weren't great. But what they don't show is the stories behind them, the thousands of talented people who just needed someone to give them a chance. A flight attendant approached with their lunch service, and Mrs. Richardson noticed how the woman's eyes lit up with genuine respect when addressing Mr. Thompson. It wasn't the forced politeness she was used to seeing, it was real admiration. The chicken is excellent today, sir, the attendant said warmly. Chef Williams outdid himself. Ah, you mean our former baggage handler turned corporate chef? Mr. Thompson replied with a proud smile. Another great story of hidden talent just waiting to be discovered. As they ate their meals, Mr. Thompson shared more stories about the former refugee who now headed their international operations, the single mother who revolutionized their booking system, the janitor whose suggestions saved the company millions in fuel costs. You see, he explained, wiping his mouth with a napkin, success isn't just about what you achieve. It's about what you inspire others to become. Mrs. Richardson looked down at her half-eaten meal, thinking about her own team back at her company. How many talented people had she overlooked because of her preconceptions? Our biggest problem in corporate America isn't lack of talent, Mr. Thompson continued, pulling out another document. It's lack of perspective. We get so caught up in our own world that we forget to look at things from other angles. He showed her a proposal for a mentorship program that paired executives with entry-level employees from different backgrounds. Sometimes the best way to change perspective is to change the conversation. Mrs. Richardson found herself nodding. I've been in marketing for 20 years, she admitted. Always thought I knew my audience. But sitting here now, she gestured to the space between them. I realize I've been missing so much. Mr. Thompson smiled encouragingly. You know what's interesting about airlines? He asked, looking out the window at the clouds below. Every seat, whether it's in first class or economy, is heading to the same destination. The only real difference is the journey there. He pulled out his business card again, this time writing something on the back. We're having a leadership summit next month. Not just about diversity on paper, but about real, meaningful change. He handed her the card. I think your experience today, your honesty about it, could be valuable to others. Mrs. Richardson took the card with slightly trembling hands. I don't know if I'm qualified to. Sometimes, he interrupted gently, the best teachers are the ones who are still learning themselves. The plane hit a small pocket of turbulence, making the overhead bins rattle slightly. Mr. Thompson smiled. Remember what I said about turbulence? It's not about the bumps, it's about how you handle them. As the plane steadied itself, Mrs. Richardson looked at the business card in her hands. The back had a personal email address and a date. She realized that what had started as the most embarrassing moment of her life was turning into something else entirely, an opportunity for real change, not just for herself, but potentially for others too. The sun was starting to set outside their window, painting the clouds in shades of gold and pink. It seemed fitting somehow, the end of one way of thinking and the beginning of something new. As the flight entered its final hour, the conversation between Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Richardson had evolved into something neither of them expected. The initial tension had transformed into an honest discussion about life, career, and the unconscious biases that shape our daily interactions. You know, Mrs. Richardson said, Looking at her reflection in the window, I've spent years attending diversity workshops and corporate training sessions, but nothing has ever hit home like today. She turned back to face Mr. Thompson. I keep thinking about all the times I might have made others feel the way I made you feel earlier. Mr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully while adjusting his reading glasses. That's exactly why I never had my photo added to the company website or annual reports, he explained. Sure, some board members thought it was unusual for a CEO to maintain such a low profile, but he gestured around the cabin. These moments of genuine interaction are worth more than any corporate headshot. A flight attendant approached with fresh coffee, and Mrs. Richardson noticed something she hadn't before: how Mr. Thompson knew each crew member's name, asked about their families, remembered small details about their lives. It wasn't just politeness, it was genuine connection. The young lady who just served us, he said quietly after the attendant left. She started as a part-time cleaner 3 years ago. Now she's working towards her pilot's license through our employee education program. People just need a chance to show what they're capable of. Mrs. Richardson thought about her own office, about the cleaning staff she barely acknowledged, the security guards whose names she never bothered to learn. I've been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder, she admitted, I forgot to look around and see who else might want to climb too. Mr. Thompson pulled out his tablet and opened a document. Let me show you something interesting, he said, bringing up a chart. These are our company's performance metrics from the past 5 years. See this spike in customer satisfaction? It happened right after we implemented our inclusive hiring program. He swiped to another page. And this, employee retention went up 40% after we started our mentorship initiative. Turns out, when people feel seen and valued, they don't just work better, they inspire others to do better too. Mrs. Richardson leaned closer to look at the numbers, her marketing brain automatically analyzing the data. These results are impressive, she said. At my company, we've been struggling with retention rates, especially among younger employees. That's actually a common issue, Mr. Thompson replied, pulling up another document. Young professionals today want more than just a paycheck. They want to work for companies that reflect their values, that show real commitment to change. He shared stories about various initiatives his airline had implemented, mentorship programs pairing senior executives with entry-level employees from different backgrounds, community outreach projects, educational partnerships with local schools. Each story revealed a deeper understanding of how small changes could create big ripples. A gentle chime indicated they were beginning their descent into Los Angeles. Mrs. Richardson realized she hadn't looked at her working mails or presentation notes for the entire flight, something that would have been unthinkable just hours ago. I have a proposition for you, Mr. Thompson said, closing his tablet. Next month, we're hosting a special session at our Leadership Summit. It's not just about diversity on paper, it's about real stories, real changes, real impact. Mrs. Richardson felt her chest tighten, already guessing where this was going. Would you consider sharing your story? He asked. Not just what happened today, but what you learned from it. Sometimes the most powerful messages come from unexpected moments like these. She looked at him in surprise. You want me to stand up in front of people and admit how terribly I behaved? I want you to stand up and show people that change is possible, he corrected gently. That we can all learn and grow, no matter our position or background. The plane descended through the clouds, the Los Angeles skyline appearing below them. Mrs. Richardson thought about how different this view looked compared to when she boarded in Atlanta, not just physically, but metaphorically. You know what the hardest part of being a leader is? Mr. Thompson asked, watching the city grow larger beneath them. It's not making decisions or handling crisis. It's admitting when we're wrong and showing others how to learn from our mistakes. As the landing gear deployed with a gentle thud, Mrs. Richardson made her decision. I'll do it, she said quietly. Not because I want to, but because I need to, because maybe someone else needs to hear it too. Mr. Thompson smiled warmly. That, he said, is exactly how real change begins. 3 months later, the grand conference hall of the Century Plaza Hotel buzzed with anticipation. Hundreds of corporate leaders, managers, and employees from across the country had gathered for the airline's annual Leadership Summit. The theme displayed prominently across the stage read, Breaking Barriers, Transforming Corporate Culture. Mrs. Richardson stood backstage, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed her note cards one last time. The past 3 months had changed her in ways she never expected. After that flight, she'd returned to her company with new eyes and a different perspective. She started learning her security guards' names, having lunch with the maintenance staff, and really listening to the junior employees she'd previously overlooked. "Ready?" a familiar voice asked. Mr. Thompson appeared beside her, looking exactly as he had on the flight, impeccably dressed, but with that same warm, approachable presence. Terrified, she admitted with a nervous laugh. "There must be 500 people out there." 527, he corrected with a smile. "Including that flight attendant from our Atlanta flight. She wouldn't miss this for the world." The memory of that day made Mrs. Richardson's cheeks flush, but not with the same shame she felt before. Now it was more like the embarrassment of looking at an old photo of yourself in a questionable outfit, recognition of how far you've come. "Remember," Mr. Thompson said gently, "they're not here to judge. They're here to learn, just like you did." The stage manager gave them their 2-minute warning. Through the curtain, Mrs. Richardson could hear the buzz of the audience, the occasional laugh, the sound of seats being adjusted. "I've been thinking about something you said on the flight," she told Mr. Thompson. "About how success isn't just about climbing higher, but about who you bring up with you." She straightened her jacket. "Since that day, I've started a mentorship program at my company. 15 participants so far." His eyes lit up with interest. "How's it going?" "We just promoted our first mentee to junior manager last week," she said proudly. "She was working in the mailroom when we started. Turns out she has an amazing head for numbers and client relations. I would have never known if I hadn't taken the time to actually talk to her." The stage lights dimmed, signaling the start of their session. Mr. Thompson would go first, introducing the topic and setting the stage for her story. "Last piece of advice?" he offered as he prepared to walk on stage. "Just speak from the heart. That's where real change begins." As she watched him walk out to enthusiastic applause, Mrs. Richardson thought about how different her life had become since that flight. Her company's culture was slowly shifting. She'd started having monthly lunch meetings with employees from all levels, creating opportunities for voices that had previously gone unheard. The sound of Mr. Thompson's voice carried through the curtain. Change doesn't always come in grand gestures or carefully planned initiatives. Sometimes it starts in unexpected places, like Seat 2B on Flight 2847 from Atlanta to Los Angeles. A ripple of interested murmurs went through the audience. Mrs. Richardson took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and prepared to share her story. When she walked onto the stage a few minutes later, the bright lights initially blinded her. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw something remarkable, a sea of faces, all different, all attentive, all ready to learn from her mistake and her journey. 3 months ago," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I was that person, the one who thought she knew everything about success, about who belonged where, about what corporate America should look like. I was wrong. And today, I want to share with you the most important business lesson I've ever learned, one that didn't come from any MBA program or corporate training." As she told her story, she could see heads nodding in recognition. Some people shifted uncomfortably, perhaps seeing themselves in her former attitude. Others leaned forward, engaged in her journey of transformation. When she finished speaking, the applause wasn't just polite. It was genuine, heartfelt, accompanied by some people wiping away tears and others turning to their neighbors in animated discussion. During the Q&A session that followed, a young employee stood up and asked, "What's the most important thing you've learned from this experience?" Mrs. Richardson looked at Mr. Thompson, then back at the audience. "I learned that true leadership isn't about which seat you occupy," she said thoughtfully. "It's about how you treat the person sitting next to you." The day ended with a networking session where person after person came up to share their own stories of prejudice faced or prejudice recognized. Each conversation reinforced what Mrs. Richardson had come to understand. That change wasn't just about big gestures or corporate policies. It was about small moments, daily choices, and the courage to admit when we're wrong and do better. As the evening wound down, Mr. Thompson joined her at a quiet corner table. "So," he said, sliding a folder across to her, "ready to take this message to other companies?" She opened the folder to find an invitation to join the airline's corporate speaking circuit, sharing her story with businesses across the country. "From first-class troublemaker to first-class teacher," she said with a small laugh. "Who would have thought?" "I did," Mr. Thompson replied simply. "The moment you decided to learn from your mistake instead of trying to justify it." As they looked out over the dispersing crowd, Mrs. Richardson realized that her journey hadn't ended, it had only just begun. And somewhere, on another flight, in another first-class cabin, another story of transformation was waiting to unfold.